Hello, everyone. First and foremost, we'd like to make the acknowledgement of the living land known as New York City, but originally known as Lenapehoking, the land of the Lenape, which today serves as the material catalytic for our virtual Zoom space. We have reason to believe that we are being joined by individuals from across the Americas and would furthermore like to acknowledge these as lands that have suffered the consequences of colonization. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Afro and Indigenous Futures series of events, which is hosted by the Liberal Studies Student Association and the Black Student Union at the New School. My name is Colton Lee. I am a student at the New School for Social Research, specifically in the Liberal Studies program, and I am a member of the Liberal Studies Student Association. And I would like my co-moderator to briefly introduce themselves.
Yes, and my name is Jose Luna, also a student at the Liberal Studies Master's Program at the New School for Social Research and member of the Liberal Studies Student Association.
Thank you, Jose. This project consists of inviting scholars, activists, and artists to talk about a diverse array of topics necessary to be worked on in order to construct an imagining of the future. A key idea to this project is that Indigenous and Afro concerns are crucial to be discussed in order to tackle existential threats in the context of the Anthropocene and imagine the possibility of future. Tonight's talk will be divided in 3 parts: a discussion on a first set of questions for about half an hour, and another discussion on a second set of questions for another half hour. Afterwards, we will open the floor for Q&A to the speakers and to open the discussion in general. The duration of this event is scheduled to be an hour and a half from 6:30 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have a question for the speakers, please type it in the chat, preceded with a Q, so the moderators can identify them in the chat. The background moderators have asked that you wait until the Q&A portion to send your questions. And finally, this event is being recorded. So if you do not want to appear on camera, please turn off your camera. Now, I'm going to pass it back to Jose to present our speakers.
Okay, hello everyone. So this is our first of a series of events, which, under the name of On Living Land. I want to thank our invitees for joining us tonight. Esme Murdock is currently an assistant professor of American Indian Studies at San Diego State University and a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Philosophy at the Pennsylvania State University for the 2020 and 2021 academic year. Her research interests include environmental justice, indigenous and Afro-descended environmental ethics, settler colonial theory, and decolonization as land and resource rematriation. Kyle Whyte is George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. His research addresses environmental justice, focusing on moral and political issues concerning climate policy and indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between indigenous peoples and science organizations, and the problems of indigenous justice in public and academic discussions of food sovereignty, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. He's an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Jaskiran Dhillon is an anti-colonial scholar and organizer who grew up on Treaty 6 Cree territory in Saskatchewan, Canada. Her work spans the fields of settler colonialism, anthropology of the state, environmental justice, anti-racist feminism, colonial violence, political ecology, and youth studies. She is the author of Prairie Rising, Indigenous Youth, Decolonization, and the Politics of Intervention in 2017, and co-editor of Standing with Standing Rock, Voices from the hashtag #NoDAPL movement in 2019. Jaskiran is an associate professor of global studies and anthropology at the New School and the outgoing president of the New School's AAUP chapter. So thank you, professors, for being with us tonight. And now I will pitch you the first couple of thought-provoking questions that we came up with and relate to epistemology. So the first question is, what would a decolonial epistemology look like? Here, we are interested in the legibility of reality, in what are the things that are visible and invisible, and how could a decolonized site be articulated? We think here about Afro and Indigenous situations of penury that are invisible, unnameable, or as Toyot says, unthinkable. What should be taught and how? In this question about epistemology, we are particularly interested in discussing education. So a complementary question to this subject could be, what would a contemporary notion of literacy be in the pressing context of the Anthropocene and its crisis? And the second question is, what are some grievances that Afro and Indigenous populations suffer collectively, and what is their role in the construction of such a decolonial epistemology? Related to this question, we are interested in exploring the possibilities that these grievances open. If we understand grief as a process of adaptation, we are curious about the creativity that could emerge from it. We are curious about your experiences or foresight on how grief has or will deliver answers to our contemporary existential threats. We are also interested in your experiences or foresight on how rites and ceremonies have changed or will change in the future and their role in a decolonial epistemology. So to sum up, the two questions are, what would a decolonial epistemology look like? And what are some grievances that Afro and Indigenous populations suffer collectively? And what is their role in the construction of such a decolonial epistemology? So the floor is yours, professors.
Thanks, Jose, for going over the questions. And I appreciate the thought that you all put into the questions. I know my co-panelists mentioned that in our virtual green room earlier, but I love to be part of events that are organized by the goals of students. And I know you all are right there at the front lines of resistance, and you're battling these academic institutions, you're battling the inequities that are outside of academia, but often caused by academia. And so I'm really appreciative of all that you all bring to what we're doing, and appreciate your acknowledgments at the beginning. So as long as I don't have to go first again, I'll go first on this. Well, I'm happy to go first a little bit further down the road, but I'll definitely go first on this one. But I'm just going to focus to start off on the decolonial epistemology question. So there's a couple of areas where that connects to some of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on. So, I work in the context of like environmentalism, and environmentalism has a lot of problems. And, one of the problems right now that's particularly concerning with climate change is that every idea that has been developed about technologies that would get us to a zero carbon or a net zero carbon situation, a lot of environmentalists, especially ones from privileged backgrounds, they don't know how to roll out those technologies in a way that will actually not be conducive to further inequity and injustice and violence. And so A lot of what I'm going to say here has to do with the fact that I've been trying to grapple with that problem, and it's particularly pressing right now in the United States when the Democratic Party is literally going to be rolling out billions of dollars that is tagged for communities affected by environmental justice. And that's not going to be a solution, just because the money has that directionality to it. And so it's an extraordinarily pressing concern for so many of us, and it should be a concern for all of you too. So I've been trying to figure out at a philosophical level, like, how is this possible? And we're just in an age where people are repeating the same sorts of stuff that happened in previous eras of colonialism. And part of the problem has to do with epistemology, though it's not the whole problem. But I want to speak to, I guess, some aspects that are epistemological and that also I can definitely connect to education. So what I realize is that there's a huge focus on thinking where folks are oriented toward mainly focusing on like problem and solution. So if you just think about your own life, like how often are we consumed with identifying problems and in trying to solve the problem? And the issue there, right, is that problem solution thinking is usually linear thinking. It's hard to make more complex, the idea that there's problems that I have to solve. It's something that's across a linear trajectory. And part of the issue, right, is that a problem, unless you're a really, really discriminatory person, right, a problem is not something you associate with other people per se, right? But a problem is some abstract thing you've constructed, and then you imagine people's relationship to that problem in ways that can be pretty poisonous to your relationships, right? And we spend time doing, well, I've got a problem, I'm not getting a good grade, and we imagine all these scenarios, right, where other people are implicated in that in different ways, and we realize, right, that we've made up different scenarios about what we think about these other people and these other people's intentions. And so that creates a toxicity. And so this is no different from what Indigenous people face with regard to the types of climate change mitigation issues that I talked about, which is we get implicated in somebody else's problems and they want to act urgently to solve the problem because their entire industrial world rests on them being able to mobilize renewable technologies to protect that world in a bubble. And so we become a problem in a lot of ways. Either we become a problem because we resist the inequitability of solar power or wind power in its various manifestations, whether it's the mining of the rare earth minerals or whether it's the land grabs that are associated with renewables, or we're a problem because they know that they're going to commit injustice and they don't want to feel guilty about that. They don't want to feel ashamed about that. And so then again, we manifest as implicated in their problems. And so I've been working on trying to introduce for folks as just part of our own healing, different ways of moving out of that linear way of thinking about things, that problem-oriented, that crisis-oriented way of thinking about things, and try to think through what does it mean not to be obsessed with crises all the time, whether little crises or big crises. And so a decolonial or an anti-colonial thinking can't be about crises all the time or can't be about problems all the time. And one of the things that's happening in Indigenous studies, and there's a lot of amazing authors working on different aspects of it, and I'll give you a few of my views on it, is we've been looking a lot about kind of kinship ways of thinking, and not in the weird anthropological way, but in a way that suits our own situations and our own histories. And so in a kinship way of thinking, I'm not that much interested in problems and solutions, but I'm actually looking more at whether the relationships I have with other people, they have the types of qualities to them that will make us possible to have that support network that's needed to respond to all sorts of different disruptions that we face, the constant changes around us, right? We're living in a world of constant change. And instead of coming to know the world as a set of problems and solutions, we come to know the world as an array of relationships that form part of a support network. So in any situation that I encounter, the way I come to know it is by first coming to know it through what type of support network I have to negotiate that situation. And what are the qualities of relationships that go into that support network? If you've got a support network where there's high degrees of consensuality, high degrees of reciprocity, high degrees of trust, all the stuff we talk about in Indigenous studies, in environmental justice studies, then you have a support network that you can really rely on, and those are the kinship qualities. And you can actually view in a perceptual way everything around you just in terms of those kinship qualities. And all of us do it even if we don't practice it, right? I mean, you get a sense of a person, of an animal, of a plant, of any aspect of the environment when you encounter them, that you're understanding how they relate to you in terms of their situation with respect to kinship. There's animals that we encounter that we know we don't have a lot of reciprocity with, right? We know there's not a lot of understanding of the consent status of that relationship. And certainly this is the case with other human beings as well. These are invisible relationships that actually for a lot of Indigenous people are quite visible and apparent relationships. And so I think part of a decolonial, anti-colonial epistemology has to do with the idea that we need to begin to get rid of the problem orientation and begin to come to know the world through kinship relationships without the trappings of linear time. So how long does it take to do something on kinship time? Well, it depends on the support network you have. If you have a support network with a lot of reciprocity and trust, it might feel quicker, even though it's not a linear time measure. If you don't know the people, if you don't know the environment, it's going to feel like a much longer duration to you, right? It's going to seem very, very far out. So it's a way of, of thinking about time in which you're measuring duration through the status of your support network relationships. And this is why education about climate change is important, because for a lot of communities, especially a lot of tribes, Indigenous people that I work with, climate change itself is not a technological problem. It's actually a kinship problem. The reason we're in the climate change mess is because back in the day, the fossil fuel industries and their allied governments violated every possible kinship norm value you can imagine to dispossess us of our lands to make way for those industries. And so for us, the whole phenomena of climate change can be solely read through contractions and breakdowns of kinship, whether it was kinship that was never there in the first place and was theoretical, or whether it was actual practice kinship relationships. And so the phenomena of climate change then today is not experienced as new, it's experienced as an ongoing threat, violence to kinship relationships, which is why the Indigenous movement has pointed out aspects of climate change that other people, especially privileged people, haven't pointed out. Connections between, climate change and different forms of trafficking and violence and abuse that occur that aren't environmental matters. But for Native people, it's not about environment and non-environment. It's all related to kinship relationships. And so there's no need to prioritize a physical environmental thing to be an environmentalist, right? If you're an environmentalist, you should be serious about kinship, and you shouldn't define yourself according to separating out something that's environmental from something that is not. And the last thing I'll just say on this is that this is why many privileged environmentalists, when they come to know the solutions to climate change, they get really urgent because they want to solve the problems. And because they're not thinking about it in kinship, they're not realizing that all of those renewable technologies are moving into areas where the institutional relationships with Indigenous people and other communities of color have been poisonous and toxic for a long, long time. And how could they possibly achieve equity in that context? But if you come to know the world as problem solution, just like all of us do in our daily lives, we really want to solve a problem. You try to ignore all the other stuff around it because you want to feel confident about your solutions. But for a lot of Native folks, a lot of communities of color, we're looking at climate change as already this breach of kinship that's been going on for generations, and it still hasn't even been attempted to be reconciled or repaired. And so for this way, we see the technologies coming into this highly toxic situation and know that there's almost impossible to think that something like consent could be established overnight, or land reconciliation could be established overnight. How could that possibly happen at the speed that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us needs to happen to avoid a certain temperature rise?
Maybe I'll step in next, and then Esme, if you want to take the lead on the next question, that would be great. And then also after, obviously you want to comment on this question too. I'm going to try and keep my comments a little succinct here. And but I want to start just by echoing some of what Kyle said, and thanking the incredible student organizers with the Liberal Studies Student Association and the Black Student Union for pulling this together in what has been a pretty challenging academic year at the New School. So I just want to acknowledge that as well, and thank you for your effort and time to get this moving. And I also just want to say, welcome my fellow panelists and say I'm really excited to be able to be in conversation with you and to continue to learn from your work, which I've already benefited from greatly. So really great to see you both here, and to have you virtually back at the New School, Kyle at least, and Esme, I hope this is only the first time and that we'll see you again soon. I'm joining you today too from my home in Philadelphia on Lenape territory. So a lot of what Kyle has offered really resonates with me, and I think a lot about the importance of a decolonial epistemology basically for everything that I do, as an educator, as a scholar, as a parent, as an organizer. I'm really deeply concerned with thinking through how the people I engage with, that I develop relationships with, that I move with in the world, understand the world around me. So clearly a kind of orientation to thinking about how we know what we know, who we become because of what we know, is really important. And so the people that are sort of living in the world of the problem and solution construct come from a particular way of knowing and understanding and making sense of the world. So for me, a sort of a decolonial or epistemology or anti-colonial epistemology works in direct opposition to so many of the ways that we're disciplined to know and to understand our world, right? So in opposition to colonial and Eurocentric knowledge systems, decolonial epistemology is a way of dismantling the social and political and knowledge base, that's infrastructure that's necessary to sustain a white settler society that is founded on the enslavement of Black people and indigenous dispossession and the exploitation of migrant workers. It is unnecessarily unsettling, it is anti-hegemonic, and I would also argue it's anchored to political goals of anti-colonial liberation struggles, at least for me. So I see a decolonial epistemology as working against the accumulation of settler histories. And we know that history and memory have a great deal to do with how we understand and make sense of the world around us. So for me, a decolonial epistemology delinks from a pre-configured colonial production of history. And then that comes with all of the problem and solution and crisis explanations and orientations that Kyle just offered us. These, of course, work in service of a white settler project that's rooted in indigenous dispossession and the racial domination of Afro-descendant peoples and people of color, right? And that is so much part of the climate change world. It's rooted in a history that privileges, white settler civilization and the entire knowledge systems upon which these countries were built as settler projects. So, in other words, it raises up an epistemological paradigm that rejects the privileging of dualism, right? The human nature dualism, all the dualisms that are central to ways of understanding Western knowledge system, universal truths, normalization of knowledge systems that, for some reason appear natural and we have to sort of accept in all kinds of spaces, educative spaces, both inside and outside of the academy. And I just want to say, and I'm going to turn it over, there's lots more I can say about how this can be taught and struggles within academia and, the politics of naming and major pedagogical questions about all of this. There's so much to say here. But one of the things that I want to say, I've had the honor and privilege of learning from so many incredible Indigenous thinkers and writers and organizers over the years. And I will say for sure that your entire framework for understanding and making sense of a contemporary historical moment in a place like the United States or Canada shifts when you actually change the epistemological center point or foundation upon which you attempt to enter these conversations. Climate change is one of them, but there are many, many others that are, of course, linked to questions of environmental devastation. And so like your whole orientation to making sense of the world just shifts. And I can give you some concrete examples of that if we have time, but I want to turn it over to Esme to have a chance to respond to this too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those comments. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I also wanted to say, I wanted to echo what was said, but also thank deeply the Liberal Studies Student Organization and the Black Student Union for organizing this. As was mentioned, this is not a typical semester and not a typical time. So, or maybe it is, I don't know, if we want to think broadly historically about that. So I want to thank you all for doing that and for organizing this in such a generous and lovely way. And I also want to thank my co-panelists. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you virtually, but hopefully someday in person too. The other thing I wanted to say is that I come from a call and response culture. So if people feel, I hope people feel welcome and invited to turn on their cameras if they're comfortable being recorded. If not, that's totally cool too. But I really get energy and am affirmed by seeing people and seeing how people are interacting with what I'm saying. So that's really cool for me. And so if people are comfortable doing that, I would invite that. And I'm one of those people who nods a lot. I like seeing nods. If you don't agree with something and you want to shake your head, like totally okay with that too. And I'm joining you from San Diego, which is Kumeyaay territory. So I wanted to mention that. So in terms of this question about decolonial epistemology, this is something I've thought a lot about. And one of the things that I want to talk about, since visibility and invisibility were part of the sort of question and have come up in what others have said before me, is that I think it's really interesting to think about how Black people, Indigenous people, people of color are what I call visibilized knowers, right? So like there is a visibility attached to our being that is made through these dominant structures such as white supremacy and colonialism and imperialism. And that visibility is often then also attached to this invisibility of our own knowledge traditions and our own knowledge productions. So I do want to draw attention to that because I think that's a really important tension to think within. And then in terms of decolonized sight, which I call decolonized perception, because I don't want to privilege sight too much, but I think that what has been said about dominant epistemological systems and structures is really important in terms of thinking about what a decolonial epistemology is. So, and I want to say what decolonial epistemologies are, because they're multiple, and that's something that I want to stress. So what I call like the dominant Western Eurocentric epistemological system is in part so instructive because it is a master narrative. It's a master epistemology. And what I mean by that is that not only is the way that we know within these structures, does it hinge upon this idea of mastery, which I consider in this context, mastery is always non-consensual. It's not something that can be consented to. And it's sort of like what I call, when I teach, like the sort of one epistemology to rule them all, right? Like this one, this one way of knowing that has been trafficked throughout the world, right? So when I think of decolonial or anti-colonial epistemologies, I necessarily think of local, place-based, indigenous epistemologies, right? Because part of the lessons we learn from colonialism and imperialism is that you cannot just export and traffic a specific, and I want to say this too, because a Eurocentric epistemology is a place-based epistemology, right? They come from a particular place. And they try to traffic and say that they're placeless and say that they're universal, but they're not, right? So it's a specific place-based epistemology that is then universalized through violence and imposed upon the rest of the world, right? So I think that when we think about what it means to do decolonial work, we actually have to think through our own traditions, through our own where we are placed, right? What our relationships and responsibilities are to the land and to the Indigenous people that are there, right? And this even is important within Indigenous communities, as Kyle was saying, right? We have to think about kinship structures. What does it mean to make kin in a land that you occupy, right? What does it mean to make kin with Indigenous people, ancestral caretakers of the land? But what does it mean to make kin with the more than human world in those places too? That's a question that exists for all of us. So in terms of that, I think that we have to move away from this idea that there's this like sort of one size fits all epistemology, even in the way that we're thinking of decolonial epistemologies, right? There's not going to be one, there cannot be, right, one master epistemology that's going to work in every place. That's just like empirically, we just know that's not true. And also to think about how the histories of Indigenous and Afro-descended people on Turtle Island is a history of movement. It's a history of displacement. It's a history of dispossession. It's a history of adapting to radically different climates, to radically different places, to radically different peoples. And that could be colonizers, right? There's like many colonizers on Turtle Island. And there's also many different Indigenous nations and Native nations. So we have to think about the really the wealth of ways of knowing and also adaptation to different systems that really root into a land-based local sort of model. And so I think that's where I'll end with that. And then is this a good time to transition to the next question?
Yeah, this is great. Thank you to all of our distinguished panelists. This is very thought-provoking. As a reminder for the structure, we will end this event in a little less than an hour from now. I'm going to give the second set of questions for our panelists to further converse on. And then after that, we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A.
Oh, I thought we were just, sorry to interrupt. I thought we were just transitioning to the second question.
Oh yeah, I'm about to give the.
Oh, okay, cool.
Oh, well, yeah, sorry, if you'd like to speak more on the second question, please.
Okay, yeah, I think, yeah, sorry. I'm just.
Go for it, Esme.
Okay, so this, just to restate for people, this is the question about some of the shared grievances of Afro and Indigenous populations, and what is their role in the construction of such decolonial epistemology. And this is a question I think a lot about. So the way that I'm going to approach it is perhaps through some of the things that I'm researching currently. So I'm currently writing a book on, it's kind of hard to talk about what you're writing a book on, but I'm going to try. So I'm writing a book on coastal South Carolina, so the Sea Islands off of Charleston, and thinking about writing it as a public land history or land ecological history that's rooted in this understanding that I find to be foundational to both Indigenous and Afro-descended philosophies, which is that land has memory. And part of doing that work is trying to understand the history of South Carolina, which is a bigger sort of challenge than I think I anticipated, and also that people might not expect, because there's so many histories in terms of just Indigenous nations, Indigenous confederacies and coalitions in that area, various deep ethnobotanical knowledges, and also then the history of enslaved Africans and Afro-descended people coming from various places on the continent of Africa, all coming together in this space, and then various colonial powers also coming into that space. So it's very complex. But one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, because it's not something that I learned in my formal education, and it's something that I've had to teach myself, right, through research as a as a professor is actually the extent of convergences in how colonial powers understood indigenous slaveries on Turtle Island. Slavery did exist within indigenous nations and communities on Turtle Island. It also existed in Africa, and in particularly Western Africa. And the colonial powers really studied and understood those forms of slavery and took components of them to make commercial slavery. Neither of these slaveries in Africa or on Turtle Island were commercialized or were commercial forms until really the interface of those communities with European powers. So I see now the way that, and the Indian trade was large in South Carolina, and Carolina as a colony was largely trafficking in Indian slaves, American Indian slaves. So understanding sort of the connection between a history that's not told, right? So like we barely talk about African race-based slavery in the context of the United States, but we don't even scratch the surface of Indian slavery. And so thinking about the connections and the intimacies that existed between Afro-descended people and Indian people who were in many cases in South Carolina enslaved on the same plantations, right? Who were listed as collateral, because a lot of the records for finding out who was enslaved in Carolina actually come from mortgage records. So you don't have like, so you literally look at these mortgage records and you can see that American Indian and African slaves were listed as collateral for loans. And that's how a lot of the property in South Carolina was owned by settlers, was through using their slaves as collateral. So that is one of the ways that I'm thinking about some of the grievances that Black and Indigenous people and Black and Afro-Indigenous people have in the context of the United States. There are many other connections in terms of just being populations that the United States targets for particular reasons, usually never good, in terms of the incidents of police brutality and violence, and also just being a population that's blamed for a lot of things in the United States, and also a population that's targeted for disappearance and for extermination, I think. So I'll probably leave it there if other people want to pick that up.
Esme, if I may, yeah, please don't let me even suggest that we don't want to hear what you have to say. So thank you for that. But now I'll move on to our second set of questions, being what are the avenues of complementation and challenges for Afro and Indigenous coalitions? We're interested in your perception of the commonalities that the Afro and Indigenous experiences share in the present and in history, and how these can serve the purpose of producing a decolonial epistemology and education. We also want to hear your ideas on the challenges that the relation between abolition and anti-colonialism holds. Furthermore, another question, what is the importance of an internationalist dimension for dealing with the construction of this epistemology we are imagining, and for coming up with solutions to the tensions between abolition and anti-colonialism? For this question, we are interested in your experiences regarding avenues of dialogue that you find between Afro and Indigenous nations that are separate geographically, and how their ideas and experiences strengthen each other. We are curious about what globality means to particular and heterogeneous experiences for Afro and Indigenous populations around the world. So to reiterate, these set of questions are, what are the avenues of complementation and challenges for Afro and Indigenous coalitions? And what is the importance of an internationalist dimension for dealing with the construction of this epistemology we are imagining, and for coming up with solutions to the tensions between abolition, and anti-colonialism.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing Esme and Jaskiran's responses previously. And what I'm going to do for a couple of statements I wanted to make right now is combine what I was going to say for question number 2 with question number 3, and then I'll stop there. But I wanted to say, so because I see them as together, and I know that the planners also saw it that way when they worked collectively to design those questions. But the thing about it is, keeping in mind that the context that Esme described, I mean, that context, that history is very real to me in the work that I do, and something I'm constantly thinking about, because as a coalitional practitioner on a daily basis, I'm facilitating, I'm negotiating, I'm trying to build relationships, especially being somebody that works in Michigan, Detroit area, between Black and Indigenous communities. And so one of the aspects in terms of grievance is that a lot of environmentalists have given us pretty raw deal. They in a settler colonial situation where you have United States settler colonialism and United States environmentalism, which is a bizarre form of environmentalism compared to what it looks like in other parts of the world, right? It was the United States that sort of birthed these ideas about separating nature into parks and don't let anybody inside unless they're a tourist and they're white, and it's, and in some kind of nuclear patriarchal cis family, and then they exported it all over the world to a horrible effect on those communities that experienced that land dispossession. But in the U.S. context, environmentalism has both erased the land-based connections of African diasporic and Indigenous communities. So we've both been erased, but then what's happened, and this is where some of the toxicity has come, is that for a lot of my colleagues who are African American and from other African diasporic communities, they very much feel a complete absence of any recognition of a connection they have to the land historically or contemporaneously. Whereas for Indigenous people, we've become this sort of like stream of environmental thought, right? Where there's like mainstream environmentalism, and it's mainly white, mainly US settler, some European, and so on. And then there's this Indigenous thing. And a lot of Indigenous folks buy into that, not wholly, but they buy into it. In some ways, it seems like a seat at the table, but it's all trying to affirm the whiteness of a lot of environmentalism, right? Because that Indigenous thread that you see, and it's out there, it's in the books, it's in the NGOs, the big NGOs, everything, right? There's this Indigenous component that's rooted in anti-Blackness. And so for Indigenous folks that play in that realm of traditional ecological knowledge, of Indigenous struggles and struggles with conservationists and so on, that can be a very anti-Black approach, right? Because it's basically environmentalists are cashing out their social justice aspects by creating this sort of artifice of this Indigenous track or Indigenous stream. And part of, and this is kind of moving into the third question, and I can speak obviously to relationships I have with Black persons, but I want to just in the short time just focus on my comments more toward Indigenous persons, that we need to actually be explicit about putting an end to that. We have to stop participating in these types of, because it's not a real seat at the table, it's a false seat at the table, and we don't get anything for it. All we get is further amalgamation with white and dominant people and less opportunities to build strength with and organizing with Black communities. And that's been a tremendous problem for us, because as Indigenous people in the US context, right, to have an alliance with our colleagues in African diasporic communities, I mean, that's real power building. I mean, the change that we could make if we had a discussion about how we've been dispossessed of our land, how we've been trafficked, how we've faced oppression from the private property system, how we've both faced different varieties of settler colonialism, and to form a land-based coalition that acknowledges our special landed relationships. And a lot of Native folks need to understand that we're not the only folks with a deep landed relationship. For many African diasporic communities, it goes back, if we're thinking on the linear scale, right, to the 1600s, right, centuries ago. And for tribes like my own, a lot of our own history and what we understand of our culture today comes from that same period. I mean, obviously there was before that, but a lot of the formation that occurred during the fur trade period and so on, that's what's meaningful for us. And it's time for us to really unify in that way, and to not allow some of the obsessiveness of white people that they are their only allies to fool us into thinking that that's what it means to have a seat at the table, because it's not.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Kyle and Esme. I feel like I'm learning so much from listening to you both, and my head is sort of moving a million miles a minute now, so I'm trying to figure out what it is I should say when. But I think the sort of the questions around, what it means to develop coalitions and how people understand themselves in relation to another is so central to a political liberation project, right? And I think sort of everything, I just want to echo, so much of what you both have already said. And for me, this is tied deeply to the question of epistemology and knowledge production and how we come to understand ourselves, partly because of the ways that we're taught history, that we develop our frameworks and ways of knowing from a very young age to think about ourselves in opposition to one another, right? As opposed to in co-constitution with one another. And so I think we have to do the work of understanding how our stories and lives and histories are co-constituted, right? As people of color, I'm the daughter of immigrants, how their entire history and relationship to quote unquote settlement on the prairies, right, is tied to an imperial project, is tied to a settler colonial project, and is also tied to an experience of, contemporary exploitation that is different from, but related to the exploitation and oppression of other peoples. So I think we have to animate our memory and understand how the sort of co-constitutive nature of these relationships better. In other words, like as Jackie Alexander says, how we become fluent in each other's histories. And for me, that I think is like absolutely important and central to how we are able to relate to want to build relationships, right? How do you build relationships in coalition, which requires coming together, building an alliance in order to struggle against a particular set of circumstances and actually build a set of political goals? It's crucial to future making, right? To thinking about how and what our world is going to look like as we move forward. And I think this requires some humility. It requires the kind of kinship building and relationality that you're both referring to. And it requires a kind of unlearning and then relearning of how we orient to one another and how we actually build together. And I'm super excited to learn more about both the work that both of you are doing that actually sits at the sort of intersection of these worlds that have been constructed as different and separate, but are so intimately tied together.
Thank you for that. I just felt like that was so beautiful, and also just so exciting for me personally. And thank you for saying that, Kyle. I feel like that was just so well said and just so necessary, because I think that part of the thing that I'm thinking about right now is the idea that, like, I don't know, I like when people say kinship or making kin, like those are ancestral practices, right? Like those are deeply rooted in our own traditions. And those are also so hard. Like making kin is not easy, especially in a place like the settler state that just wants to kill you all the time, right? Like, so this idea of making kin, right, is actually super difficult. But I also wanted to say, because I think this is so well said in some of Kim Tallbear's work, is that like that's actually our traditional touchstone, right, is making kin in new worlds, in different worlds. And so I think that that's really a site of resistance and also a site of solidarity to think about how our own ancestors, like whoever you are, right, have made kin in the past and how they're working on doing that now. And I think that for Indigenous and Afro-descended people on Turtle Island, like we made kin with each other, right? Like in a lot of instances, it's not just sort of like a historical anomaly. So I think that That's absolutely right. And also thinking about landed relationships through the lens of making kin, I find very fruitful for disrupting some of the ways that those people want to appropriate Indigenous and Black and people of color epistemologies or ways of knowing for the purpose of capitalism and property accumulation, right? So like because I think that's what I see as one of the major theoretical obstacles that is coming up not only in Indigenous studies, but also in Black studies, right? Like if we want to talk about labor, we want to talk about political economy, we want to talk about land, but there's this I think there's this like cross-purpose discussion that's happening when we talk about, when we presume, and I think this is something that Black scholars, and I'll include myself in that in terms of having to think through our resistance to some of the ways that we think about land as economically important, which obviously it is, right? But also part of what I'm trying to argue in some of my work is that the foundation of Black relationship to place, Afro-descended enslaved African relationship to place, and on through descendants, myself included, is to think, no, we had relationships with land that were excessive of labor, right? Like in terms of capitalist understandings of labor, and that were excessive of land as being property, right? Now or in the past. And I think that this idea of making kin, that's something we did with land and we do with land that gets us sort of like, I think in some way out of part of that trap of coming back to, right? Like, okay, what's the land doing? Who is the land? Who owns the land in this like really capitalistic proprietary way? It's like, who had relationship, right? And like, what were those relationships like? Who made kin with different people, with different more than human others, right? Like all of these things are part of our history, and they're part of the way that we are related to this place in a way that's not just this purely negative. And that's not to say that I downplay the history of enslavement or the afterlives of slavery, because those are absolutely real, right? But I'm just trying to think through, how do we get out of some of these traps that I think aren't actually our traps, right? They're like traps set by other people, right? And that they're very persuasive, right? They're very effective traps, I would say. And so I'm trying to think through how we actually get to a place of being like, you know, we're not interested in this trap, right? We're interested, and I think to Kyle's point too, like, imagine what we could do with like land-based coalitions of Black and Indigenous people on Turtle Island and people of color, right? Like, imagine what that could look like. And it's not just like, you know, accepting the sort of scraps begrudgingly thrown from the table. And it is very begrudgingly, I want to say that, because working in the sort of like environmental philosophy world, this stuff is resisted so furiously. Like it's and the reason it's resisted so furiously is because there's an interest in having these cultural or symbolic reconciliations and not actually doing the work, which is the easiest part, right? Give the land back, give people money. Like that's the basic, the lowest common denominator of action you could do. And they're not willing to do it. So they're doing like these contortions to sort of symbolize some sort of new era of relating. And I think that we have to stop falling for that trap, because it is a trap.
Yeah, I appreciate all these I I keep getting connected to what each of you are saying, and I'm like, oh yeah, I've got to respond to that one that question too, which I already was thinking about. I want to say a few things about the fourth question, and they also reflect a kind of a combo again of of questions 2 and 3, and I'm glad for the the scaffolding that Esme and Jaskiran have been providing for all that's been said, and absolutely look forward to our broader exchange in a few minutes. In terms of this question about globality and internationalism. And I know there's some specific things that those terms can can mean, but I just want to pick up on a couple of the threads though that are significant to the work that I do. So one of the actual challenges that I face in Black and Indigenous coalition making is sort of this presumption that when we're talking about sovereignty, we must be talking about Native people. And this idea that as a diasporic people, as people that endured the forced arrival to North America, that the Black people somehow by default are invested in the U.S. nation state in a way that sort of Indigenous people are not. And that's been a very poisonous perspective. And it's a lot of Native folks that hold that perspective. I mean, I've also heard Black individuals say that, but in a way that was kind of critical of their cultures and societies. But it's very problematic because remember, and I work with a lot of federally recognized tribes. A lot of us have bought in heavily to a certain type of U.S. authorized nationalism, right? Where federal recognition, operating like a state. And oftentimes Native people use terms like treaty rights as a symbol for decolonization, when not even every tribe has treaties. And actually, the countries where treaties with Indigenous people exist are all wealthy countries, right? It's Canada, the US, New Zealand. And there are some other cases of treaty making, like in Chile and others, but the bulk of treaty rights mainly applies in those national contexts. And it doesn't even apply to every Indigenous person, right? And so, we get used to using these terms that are both, kind of toxic internally within Indigenous people, but then also sort of suggest that there's a kind of landedness, a kind of sovereignty that Indigenous people sort of have the monopoly on, when again, that's very far from the truth. And we need to investigate our own investments in a certain type of buying into the US project, right? The United States, as part of its colonial project, has tried to nationalize many tribal economies, tried to make us mimic states, and tried to get us to this point where we're considered part of this, family of sovereigns that make up the United States. And so we can have a lot of allyship with our colleagues who are from African diasporic communities is if we also engage in that abolition, right? That we need to be about abolition as well, that we can actually use that notion to investigate critically some of the assumptions that many of us bring to understanding sovereignty. And because a lot of the best work in Indigenous studies, challenges the idea that a treaty or a law or a right is the actual basis of sovereignty as it's recognized by a colonial power like the US. And instead, we have to think about sovereignty in terms of kinship, in terms of relationality. And that means that that's a point of discussion for other communities like African-American communities who exercise self-determination, who exercise collective decision-making, who exercise cultural forms of continuity, and have a number of lessons that we can learn about what it means to maintain cultural institutions and strengthen cultural institutions under hostile conditions, under carceral conditions, under police violence and custodial violence conditions. And so this is part of what the global perspective means, right? Is that, it's not white academics that, have the monopoly on global because of some presumption to abstraction. We look out from our groundedness and have local and global and regional perspectives. And the more we can distance those from certain subscriptions to national narratives about who we are and who our identity is, whether it's a civil rights narrative, a treaty rights narrative, then we're truly enacting a kind of globality that can be anti-colonial.
Yeah, sorry, I was just looking at something in the chat, so I got distracted for a second, but I totally agree with that. I mean, I think there is everything that you said, Kyle, I think there is definitely, we have to place a great deal of importance on looking at the ways that state-centered narratives and interventions around what social change and transformation look like actually push us into acting in certain ways in relationship to one another. And this includes like thinking about liberation struggles in the global South. So for me, a kind of a sort of a solidarity, an internationalist solidarity that looks at the way that, you know, racial global capitalism is deeply pervasive, is tied to everything that happens in a place like the United States, you know, forces us to confront this notion that here is there and there is also here. So in sort of your mapping of the various scales, you know, you have local, you have regional, you have, you just sort of scale out larger and larger, you can begin to trace the interlinkages. And of course, you don't have to look far to think about the ways that, you know, an anti-colonial analysis allows us to see the way that the architecture of colonial building actually transits all over the world and has historically, right? So to Africa, to the Middle East, to South America, to Asia, to all places where international finance, capital, and colonial development projects actually move. And I think states do their best to carry out the projects of colonialism here in the lands that we understand to be these settler colonial projects and internationally. So for me, kind of an imperial, an anti-imperialist position that sort of thinks about how our struggles are linked and interlinked across the globe is really, really deeply important. You know, and we, you know, there's so many ways to think about this. Easy ways are just thinking through the Canadian, you know, the role of Canadian mining corporations in the environmental wreckage in Latin America, right? The ways that the US military, which is, you know, the pervasiveness of US militarism, the United States owns the deadliest and most funded military power in the entire world. It's also the largest environmental polluter on the planet, right? If you look at one country, of course, that's in the news again, Afghanistan, and the sort of deep environmental wreckage in Afghanistan since the US presence there, right? So in my view, we have a responsibility to think about a decolonial project that transcends colonial borders, right? That actually centers an imperial project that is deeply tied to a settler colonial project, and a project that is consistently working to enact violence against Afro-descendant people, Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color and migrants on the territories that we live on.
And I'll just say, I'll try to just say something briefly at the end. I think, and maybe this is controversial to say, but I'm going to say it anyway because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think that the distinction between abolition and decolonization, I think that might be another epistemological trap. Like I think it might be, in terms of just thinking about how I don't see those things at cross purposes. And part of the reason I don't see those things at cross purposes is because abolition is about imagining and creating a world in which these structures don't exist, right? Like these structures like the police, right? Like imprisonment, like incarceration. And decolonization is actually about the same thing, right? It's about building a world that's not fundamentally built on coloniality, right? That doesn't see domination as the like norm for relating to others, and I mean others, not just human others, but like more than human nature. And I think I get this a lot also from Fanon, who I think is misread a lot in terms of being like this like completely out of it, like violent anti-colonial thinker. But like what Fanon was actually talking about, right, was like how we can't keep working within these systems, right? We can't keep trying to reform. And so decolonization is about getting out of the whole system, right? It's about returning to our own tried and true sort of traditions of how it is that we relate differently. And I think what's so interesting about the resistance both to decolonization in concrete ways through like land back and resources back movements, and also resistance that's given to abolish the police or abolish, right, like the carceral state, is that it's coming from the same place, right, of not wanting to imagine outside of that paradigm or build or create outside of that paradigm. And it's also resistance in the sense of people resisting that because they cannot imagine or understand a world in which the people who have been disinherited, the people who have been dispossessed, the people who have been pushed to the bottom of this racial hierarchy in this white supremacist regime would not do the same thing to them. And I think that's just really sad and really, but really telling, right? To see like actually when you push people to the most basic form of change and the amount of good that could create, that the resistance is coming from a sort of like intimate familiarity with domination and the resistance to letting that go, right? So maybe with that we can transition to opening it up to the Q&A.
Thank you, Esme. Thank you, all of you. Those are so many things to think about. Yeah, but before we go to the Q&A, I wanted to tell you that today's event is the first of a broader initiative to foster work that envisions decolonized Afro and Indigenous futures, including film screenings, theory discussion groups, social media engagement, and creative working groups. And it will culminate in a two-day conference in the fall, featuring student work alongside presentations from prominent scholars and activists, artists. So let us know if you would like to be involved. We have our social media already running. Yeah, so now we would like to proceed to questions from the public or comment in general, and if you will. Okay. Wait. Silvana, do you perhaps have questions sent to me that I didn't see? Because, okay, there's one that I see from Yanis. Would you like to voice it, or would you like me to read it for you?
I can read it. What's the how do we reconcile indigeneity with open border migration? I think there is a tension there, and settler colonialism, but also the broader idea of like immigration. Thank you.
I appreciate the question. You know, one of the things we struggle with the most is that, you know, and thinking back to some of the histories that Esme was discussing is that, you know, I don't know exactly when it happened, but somehow there got to be this idea that like a tribe is some like local entity, and that indigenous sustainability means some like group that's cut off from everybody, doesn't trade with anybody, has no diplomacy, and is just like self-contained. And you know, really, for any tribe that actually is in such a situation, it's because the United States put them there, or because Canada put them there. And historically, right, if you look at the information, we had continental hemispheric trade networks without all of the bizarre transportation technology that you have today. And that's a lot of kinship, and over time, sedimented generational kinship. And we're just scratching the surface of what we know. And so remember, the discussion about kinship is one of the biggest fallouts of colonialism from an intellectual standpoint, is that we've had to start by talking about, you know, local relations in terms of kinship, but kinship is scalable. It scales up. And part of the importance, right, is that we're not just advocating for decolonial, like local sustenance, but for the broader regional, hemispheric, and today global networks. And so there are a lot of histories of how indigenous people understood migration, understood people that changed identities and affinities in different societies. In fact, part of the problem and that people have forgotten is that, actually, remember, the Europeans, and I'm just speaking from the Great Lakes, didn't actually know how to categorize us. And they started, because they couldn't figure out, they'd see somebody show up in one place who'd say they were one thing, they'd see that person during another season and they'd say they were another thing. Native people, like Anishinaabe people, for example, didn't have the same name all year round. Where part of multiple social and governmental formations that were sovereign at different points during the year and lived in many different locations throughout the year. And part of why we survived a good chunk of colonialism was because of that capacity to expand and to shrink and to be able to do that, right? Like an accordion. And so for us, right, migration was actually the norm, right? Constant migration, constant motion. And so now we're in an issue that a severe settler form of containment has created an issue, right, where you have migration problems tied to rights and to laws, and where there's no kinship, there's no caretaking, and there's no respect for actually the history that a lot of groups primarily thought and articulated what it means to be a constantly migratory society across entire hemispheres and continents.
Yeah, I'll just add to that and say that I totally agree with that. And I think the sort of the way that the problem becomes constructed in this sort of question, in the ways that people think about border control is exactly the US settler project, right? That's where the militarization of the border and the management of the border and the control and containment of the border comes from the creation of boundaries and territories from a colonial power, right? Not the indigenous peoples who have particular relationships to kinship and trade and migration, in the past and present and will in the future. So I think that again is another, I think, inheritance of the colonial infrastructure of the ways that we relate to one another.
So if I understand it right, the right to migration is the solution to this conundrum. So you should have the right to go anywhere. Is that, am I understanding this right? And that's the Native Americans also tradition, that they would move from place to place?
Well, we do need to get on to the other questions, but I would just say no, it's not tied to rights, because that right can be used oppressively, and we've seen privileged people use rights as a smokescreen for being able to impose themselves on other people non-consensually, right? If it was about a right to migration, then the fossil fuel industry could just do whatever it wanted anywhere. So it's about actually systems of responsibility authorizing constant motion that strengthens people's resilience, as opposed to creating economic, social, and other forms of violence. But yeah, we can totally talk about this, but we definitely have to move on to other stuff. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question from David Curry. Do you want to voice that, or do you want me to read it? Please let me know.
No, I'll unmute it. I'll ask people, because this is a little complex, and I don't want to take all of the air and oxygen. But in the chat, I asked the question. I am also, like you, Esme, writing a book. It's called For the Good of All Now. Create your own circle of happiness and serenity from local to global. And I think it touches on everything that you have spoken about here. And I wondered if that might, the template that I'm looking to try and create, which is a global movement for an evolutionary transition to oneness, is something that connects quite deeply with our earliest roots. So if I can take maybe 2 minutes, I'll go through this really, really quickly. So the evolutionary scale, right? So we've had 4 major evolutionary transitions. We're about to go into the 5th. The first one was mythos. For Lucy, running across the savannas of Africa, she was nature. She was not separate from nature. She was nature. For many indigenous cultures, this still holds true today. Not for the civilized cultures, right? The dominant cultures in at least the world that we are living in. So from mythos, it went to theos. We learned animal husbandry, we settled, we created cities. We then had as above, so below. We created gods and deities and creation myths. And then around the late 1400s, we moved to another major transition. So this is the era of Galileo and Leonardo and Newton. right? And that was to logos. Ultimately, I think, therefore I am, the Cartesian philosophy, now man was separate from nature. We really began our true separation. We had begun it in the 1400s and really separated from nature. But not so, I think, I would dare say, for those cultures that were still rooted to land and to none of these structures that are really legislated, if you think about it. They're all legislated downwards, right? So it's a question of control. So for the good of all is from Gandhi, right? It's for the greatest, trying to make good for the good of all. One of the ancient practices back in
Hey David, you're at 2 minutes now.
Okay.
And actually, I was just going to suggest that since you took the time to provide that information, that we'll just let that serve as our response time, because I know there's a bunch of students and in addition to you that have questions. So yeah, appreciate the sharing, David.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so there's, I don't know if, first of all, would you want to reply to that? Either of you, Esme?
Oh, we'll go on to the next question, Jose.
Okay, so there's another one from Peter Heft. Do you want to voice that, or should I?
Sorry, was that me, my question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess my question is, like, this is admittedly either a super broad or super simple question, but I think it might frame further discussion. And I guess the question is just like, what is violence? Like, presumably it's more than mere physical force.
Okay, thank you. Any response? Any?
Well, I was going to say, Kyle and I are both philosophers, so maybe we could punt that question to Jaskiran. Because I could imagine that we would be here for a while if either of us tried to answer that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer it succinctly either. I'm teaching a class right now on the politics of violence, and that question actually sits at the center of the class that I'm teaching. And so just to sort of respond quickly in the sort of interest of time, and I see you have in parentheses, it's presumably more than violence. Yeah, sort of what I center on doing with the students is having them think really expansively around what violence is, how it's constituted, how it's, you know, tied to histories of domination, of occupation, of violence, of power and domination. And we think about it across a range of different kinds of, I would say, scales and formations, you know, including epistemic violence, which is sort of at the center of what we're talking about today, but also, you know, physical violence and all of its manifestations that exist, historical violence, and then, you know, we think through the sort of the formulations of resistance around the various conceptualizations of violence too, and think hard about how sort of macro structural colonial infrastructures of violence are tied to the ways that people live in the everyday. So to really work against the sort of bifurcation of experience and separation of experience in the ways that people understand and make sense of their everyday realities as they relate to violent experiences of violence.
Great. We have another question from Noira Carranza. Would you want to voice that, or should I?
It's Carrasana. Yes, I would like to voice that. I heard that Esme and Kyle, most likely I heard like multiple times they were talking about the African diaspora, and Esme was talking about in terms of land. So my question is, what disconnects African descent people outside of the United States in terms of land? Because I am originally from Cuba. I've been living in San Diego, California for about 7 years. So what is the disconnection that we have? What was the reference that you guys were using?
So if I could just restate, just for my own clarification, you're asking about Afro-Diasporic people outside of the United States and what's their connection to land or disconnection to land?
Disconnection. What the disconnection that we have?
I don't know if I would frame it as disconnection. I mean, I think in terms of Afro-Diasporic peoples the world over, right, you're thinking about the various structures of oppression and power that have brought particular people to particular places. So I'm thinking in the context of the transatlantic slavery, but obviously, like when we think about global Blackness, that's not the history or the starting point for various Afro-descended people. But I think in terms of in terms of thinking through some of the ways that those experiences might be similar, like we have to tell those histories in terms of the local and in terms of the experiences and the ways of knowing those people continue. So I'm looking at just sort of like what it was about in terms of the native Southeast, and also a little bit of the way that indigenous slavery played out in the Great Lakes region. But I think that's a question that it has to be looked at like in the specific sort of instance. I don't know if that's answering your question, but sort of the way that those histories of connection and continuity to different places throughout the Americas is really, I think, is about the relationships that people built and formed and made with particular landscapes and particular peoples.
Yeah, and just super quickly, I know the recording will be the evidence, but when I was mentioning connections to land, I was just making the point that one of the myths that can be very toxic, and I don't know that Native people were the ones that necessarily invented this, but it was the idea that African Americans and other African diasporic people don't have a connection to the land, and that connectedness is mainly Native people. I was suggesting that that's an untruth, and it's one that's created divisions.
Thanks so much. I will proceed to the next question from Pingala. Would you want to voice it or should I? Okay, I will proceed then. How to prevent decolonization from becoming a reactionary themes, as pointed out by ex-Muslims and as Debbie Shakti, practitioner. My question is how to prevent the colonial studies from reinforcing regressive patriarchy in India.
Well, I can't speak to to India and other contexts outside of the ones I work in, but what I would say is that problematic and oppressive forms of decolonial or anti-colonialism is something that we struggle with every day. Just here in the indigenous context in the U.S. And so I would just say that if we're talking about coalition building between Native folks here and folks in India on anti-colonialism, that we'd have a lot to talk about, I think, on that topic and subject.
I was going to say basically the same thing. So I think that, the whole premise of coalition and how we're understanding each other's history and sharing knowledge and ideas and building relationships is part of the way that you work against the appropriation of decolonial epistemology or framework for the advancement of worse conditions than we have now, or the reproduction of worse conditions than we have now.
If I may, because we're coming close to the end of our time, before I officially close this off, I would like to ask all of our panelists, would you like to share how you may be reached, and any resources, plug any of your work, or just any words to leave us with?
I'll put some links for the organizations I'm part of in the chat right now. Give me a second, but keep going.
Any final or closing thoughts?
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and for being here. I think it was such a lovely invitation and organized event, and I'm just so happy to see people and to get the opportunity to talk with Jaskiran and Kyle. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll also just echo my thanks to the organizers again for pulling this together, and for everyone for joining us. And I'm at the New School, so if you're a New School student, I'm easy to find, so track me down. And it looks like Kyle has posted several links in the chat. And Esme just posted Twitter.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you all time to check the chat and check all those out. Kyle, did you have any final words?
No, appreciative for what my colleagues have brought, and look forward to keeping in touch and moving forward coalitionally, whether we interact directly or not. There's a lot of scales to coalition.
Indeed. And with that, I would like to say that us New School students of the Liberal Studies Student Association and Black Student Union would like to extend our most immense gratitude to our distinguished panelists, and also to the great turnout of our various guests. We feel passionately about what we are doing for this Afro and Indigenous Future series, so it means so much to know that you all care as well. We anticipate sometime soon explaining even more of our background story of how and why we decided to form and begin this series. So please stay tuned for our future events. Follow the Black Student Union, of course, and all of our socials. And please also follow NSPDOS, the New School Policy and Design for Outer Space, who is another organization with which we are closely related and connected. This was an Afro and Indigenous Futures event, reminding you, as always, to imagine a brighter future. Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Good night.
Good night.